Good afternoon and welcome. I invite those of you who are still middle-aged to come on in and find a seat. My name is Micah Watson, and I teach here in the Political Science Department at Calvin College. This is our last time as a group as we close up the conference. I want to take a moment. Several of the panelists have been kind enough to mention me, but this has been very much a team effort, so I want to take a moment to recognize the people that have made this conference possible, starting with you. So thank you for coming here this afternoon. Thank you, particularly those of you who have registered for the conference and may have traveled. It is a tough pitch sometimes, Western Michigan in early December. So we appreciate you coming here, and students as well, if you've come across the bridge, or colleagues, or if you're here in Grand Rapids, we appreciate you being here. I want to offer special thanks to the Acton Institute, Dan Churchwell, my colleague on this conference, who worked together. Jordan Baller also was very helpful in thinking about this conference. My colleague here at Calvin, Kevin Dendulk, and the Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics. And then we've also had a lot of help, people you have not seen but have made this possible, the logistics. Ellen Heckman, Margie Stife, and then a couple great students, Renee Maring and Carly Cronkite, excuse me. So just thank you to them. Now, I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker for this afternoon. Our hope for the conference was to have several panels with opportunity for good conversation and a couple plenaries that might be a little more exclamation point-ish, right? And I think we had a few exclamation points last night with our plenary from my former teacher. I still am learning from him, Patrick Deneen. Grateful that he came down. He will tell you I've not learned enough from him on some things. But when we're thinking about who would be a great voice to send us off after what we've been talking about these last couple days, we knew immediately who we wanted, and that was our colleague here at Calvin, Jamie Smith. And I'm going to give you the very quick, the longer I go, the shorter we have with him. So I'm going to try and be quick. But the very quick, of course, background of Jamie is he has more books than I can give you, and I would take up all the time if I were to list all the things that he's done. But most recently, of course, he's known for the Cultural Liturgies trilogy. So we have Desiring the Kingdom and Imagining the Kingdom and Awaiting the King. And we also have his book, You Are What You Love, which takes many of those lessons and provides them in a different sort of format. We have just recently submitted a book on Augustine, which we can look forward to as well. He is the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview, teaches philosophy, all those things. The other way I want to introduce him, though, is by telling a joke. And the joke is, it's a short joke. Well, no, it's not a short joke. It is a short joke. I guess you have shared with me that someone once came up to you on campus and asked if you were me. And we found that humorous. But the joke is about a very prominent Harvard professor. And was always doing different events and very much in demand. And the joke was, what is the difference between God and this Harvard professor, called Professor Jones? And the answer was, well, God is everywhere. Professor Jones is everywhere but Harvard. He's always gone. And so that is actually not true of Jamie Smith. He is in demand. He is a sought-after speaker and author. I want to give you, and this is an odd way of telling this, so I have to tell about myself. I don't do a whole lot of that, but I was in Alabama for a conference at a Church of Christ school and heard a talk about a prison ministry there. And without the person knowing where I was from, this author, this person working in the prison ministry, talked about how inspired he was, how informed he was by the work of Jamie Smith. So Jamie Smith's work having an impact on this prison ministry in Alabama. I was talking with a chaplain at another CCCU school that will go unnamed, and we're talking about their approach to student life and what it meant to be sensitive pastorally to lots of difficult concerns. And he says, Jamie Smith's fingerprints are all over our approach to how we do that here at this school. I was talking with another graduate student who were doing a sort of podcast thing, and I think he asked me to do the podcast mainly because afterwards he wanted to ask me if I could get him in touch with Jamie Smith. He said that he was interested in higher education because of what he had read from Jamie Smith. So, which is to say that we have someone here that's going to be speaking to us who is speaking at all these different places, but very much present as well in Grand Rapids. The husband of Deanna, a faithful member at Sherman Street CRC, father of Grayson, Colson, Madison, and Jackson, And I'm just very pleased to introduce my colleague and friend, Jamie Smith, and have him finish this off with this conference. So.
Thank you so much. My life at Calvin College is pulling microphones way down, especially if you're friends with Micah Watson and Kevin Dundalk. So thank you very much, Micah, for this opportunity, but for that very kind introduction. Thanks so much for being here in the dreaded after lunch slot at 1:15. I want to make just a couple of prefatory comments, provisos, before I dive in. The first is I blame Micah on kind of setting us up to fight, right? In other words, our job is a little bit to disagree. I actually think Professor Dineen and I agree on a lot. And I would say especially the first part of Awaiting the King is where you would look to see us sharing our concerns about the deformative effects of liberalism. But my job here this afternoon is to disagree. So don't overestimate how much that's true. The second thing is I just want to say this. The title of my talk is Thank God for Liberalism. 10 years ago, I could not have imagined ever giving a talk with that title. In fact, that my 40-year-old self is sort of rolling over in his grave a little bit at that prospect. But things have changed, and in many ways, this is me trying to, I hope this is an exercise in a kind of intellectual honesty. I would also say 10 years ago, I could never have imagined that I would become a citizen of the United States, which we did in August. And that was a very fraught and significant decision for us, but it was a decision for me. It was a decision about also a kind of intellectual honesty and trying to be less parasitic in my presence to this experiment. And so this talk is an expression of that, if you will. So permit me to begin with something of a parable, or you might call it a fable. Imagine our nation's infrastructure is crumbling. It's easy if you try. Corroded rebar is emerging from the underside of decaying overpasses like driftwood poking out of the sand when the tide ebbs. Concrete rubble frustrates our daily commute. The nation is a maze of detours because tunnels have collapsed. Dilapidated buses trundle slowly where trains used to ride the rails that have rusted away. It feels like civilization is coming to an end. In this fable, there are two different responses to this situation. Some step up as defenders of the infrastructure. They see the ruin, they lament it, and they try to motivate society to invest in repairing it. Otherwise, we risk losing all the progress and promise we've realized over the past centuries. Rebuild it better is the defender's motto. But there's another curious response from a different camp. They see repair as a fool's errand. They describe ruin as what they call planned obsolescence. Repair is futile, they say. Instead of trying to rebuild our roads and bridges, they tell us, we should stop driving cars. Crumbling bridges should be welcomed so that we can finally have jetpacks. This is mostly an excuse because my favorite band name in the world is We Were Promised Jetpacks. We were promised jetpacks, and we forgot that Albert the Great already sketched the plans for jetpacks in the 12th century. Long before Gottlieb Daimler dreamed up the infernal internal combustion engine and Henry Ford suckered us all into buying cars. And look what freedom of the road has gotten us. Vehicular deaths, automobile insurance, the dreaded DMV, not to mention teenagers in back seats. Cars themselves have become a regrettable detour. The collapse of our transportation system is a chance to go back and start over where Albert the Great left off. Now, granted, maybe not everybody's going to get jetpacks, but the rest of us should remember the simple joys of walking and the romance of journeys on horseback. Embrace being local, and you won't even notice that you don't have a jetpack. Embrace the ruin as a way to remember what could have been. Ruin is the disruption we need to see we were never meant to drive. Let she who has ears to hear, hear. I hope you can hear the allegorical parallel. Many contemporary observers see a crumbling social infrastructure around us, the erosion of family stability, unfettered self-interests and quests for unconstrained self-expression, widening inequalities and a lack of concern for the common good, university halls reduced to shouting matches rather than spirited, rational debate, elections beholden to moneyed interests and a democratic process hijacked by misinformation, tribalism and individualism that rend the patchwork quilt we tried to stitch together into a national identity, a creeping disenchantment with the political process overall, and an anti-institutionalism that has left us with only the vulnerable, expressivist individual and the growing behemoth that is the state. It feels like civilization is unraveling. For some, this situation calls for repair, reform, renewal. We need to rebuild a liberal society better, repair the institutions and virtues that made it possible for us to live together in a free, flourishing, and prosperous society. The frailty of our liberal society is a result of our failure to maintain it. But for some critics of liberalism, this corrosion of our social architecture is a feature of planned obsolescence, an end that was built into the very beginning of liberalism. What frustrates and disappoints and frightens us today, these critics argue, is actually the fruit of liberalism, not its rot. Or perhaps liberalism's fruit is cultural rot. The problem isn't that liberalism isn't working, or rather that some disease has beset what is otherwise a healthy body politic. Rather, liberalism's failure is endemic to its design. Liberalism has failed, Patrick Deneen concludes, quote, because liberalism has succeeded. As it becomes fully itself, it generates endemic pathologies more rapidly and pervasively than it is able to produce band-aids and veils to cover them up. So Deneen accuses this implosion, assesses this implosion across an array of cultural spheres and institutions: democratic politics, technology, education, consumer economies, and he tries to show how the disillusion of communities by rabid individualism and ever-widening demands for liberation is undercutting the bonds we need for human flourishing. But for Deneen, these are all implosions that result from a time bomb that was built into the very foundations of liberalism. So here's my question this afternoon, and it's a question that Jeff actually put on the table at the end of the last panel. When, according to Deneen and similar critics, was the doomed cornerstone laid? How long has this bomb been ticking? Who lit the fuse that is now hastening to the powder keg? This diagnosis, you'll note, is tethered to a very specific set of historical claims. The pathology is a genealogy. If today we experience the systems, the question is, when did we catch this disease? Now, it seems to me Deneen is a bit cagey about the answer to this question. But I think the attentive reader can work out the timeline. Liberalism, in this critique, is synonymous with modernity, or more specifically, the post-medieval. If you want to do the math, consider the penultimate sentence of his book. Quote, after a 500-year philosophical experiment that has now run its course, the way is clear to building a new and better. End quote. Huh. I wonder what happened 500 years ago. When did we make our wrong turn? Not with the Trump presidency or the Obama presidency, not in the 60s, not during Jim Crow or the antebellum South, not the French or the American revolutions. All of those are already symptoms of a virus we designed and embraced in the 1500s, even if it was Rousseau and Locke who retroactively explained what we had done. And just what happened in the 1500s? The great unspoken agent in this story, which goes largely unnamed, but whose presence is felt in these calculations, I think it was named last night, is the Protestant Reformation. Where Deneen decries individualism, the erosion of medieval pacts, the fragmentation of society, it doesn't take too much imagination to see that this is a covert restatement of old Catholic polemics revivified by the likes of Brad Gregory. Whenever Deneen holds up Christian ideals in contrast to liberalism, the discerning reader will note the pattern. Deneen's Christianity never makes it past the Middle Ages. For Deneen, like MacIntyre before him, liberalism just is liberal individualism, and Protestantism is the virus of individualism let loose on Christendom. Those Protestants nodding along to Deneen's analysis would do well to pause and consider whether they should be sympathetic to his diagnosis or whether they are actually the pathogen that he's talking about. If the disease of liberalism is synonymous with the 500-year-old experiment of Western democratic societies, then modernity is the problem, which explains why Deneen is given to a certain kind of nostalgia for the medieval. It's a sort of Wendell Berryism on steroids that not only invokes agrarian idols, but romanticizes medieval markets as the paradigm of altruistic local economies. Just don't ask about the caloric intake for peasants under those structures, or the capital built on the back of enslaved peoples. That one could be nostalgic for this, could rather blithely appeal to medieval configurations with little qualification, exhibits what I worry is a tone deafness to the present, as well as a very selective and creative attention to the past. Perhaps I could put this starkly to save time. While Deneen rightly laments the emergence of a kind of unbounded autonomism, I'll call it for lack of a better term, a disordered conception of freedom that views any and all constraints as violations, he seriously undervalues the way that liberalism has unleashed forces of liberation in modernity that liberated peoples and groups from the tyranny and unchecked authority of those who used to occupy supposedly natural seats of power. Lamenting individualism is the luxury of people who've been recognized as individuals. And the legacy of recognition that gave rise to liberation was not medieval, despite some fudged attempts to have his cake and eat it too. When he tries, for example, to argue that many of the institutional forms of government that we today associate with liberalism were at least initially conceived and developed over long centuries preceding the modern age, as he puts it early on. It might well be that the siege which gave rise to the developments he highlights, constitutionalism, separation of powers, separate spheres of church and states, rights and protections against arbitrary rule, it might be that those seeds are older than modernity and the Reformation, but there is overwhelming evidence that those sources weren't marshaled to that end until the reform movements of the Renaissance and early modernity. It's no accident that these features of liberalism that we value emerged first in those lands where the Reformation took root. So invoking the medieval and Catholic while disparaging the modern and Protestant undersells and overlooks the realizations of justice that have attended the development of modern liberalism, especially for peoples historically marginalized and vulnerable. To take just one concrete example of this selective attention, consider his brief consideration of the liberation of women under liberalism. I'm so glad, actually, unbeknownst to each other, both Dr. Riddle and Dr. Dumais focused on the exact same theme and passage. With nary a mention of suffrage as the unleashing of human agency for women in the body politic, Deneen immediately slides to consider the deleterious effects of women's liberation and summarizes it as a faux liberation that only frees them for the same bondage as men. Liberalism, quote, posits that freeing women from the household is tantamount to liberation, but it effectively puts women and men alike into a far more encompassing bondage, end quote. This is the kind of flattened equivalence you can decry precisely when liberation is something you've watched rather than something that you've experienced. I wonder how many women in Deneen's orbit would be eager to retrieve the gifts of medieval freedom. In his laborious preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit, you didn't see Hegel coming here, did you? Hegel famously criticized the Romantics for their oversimplification of consciousness, and he uses this line, they render a night in which all cows are black, because they don't have enough light to highlight the distinctions and differences. I found myself recalling this as I read Deneen, who renders an era in which all liberalisms are equal. I think this stems from a certain flatness of his analysis that can't recognize the difference between, let's call it something like liberalism as a polity versus liberalism as an ethos. I'm really not wed to these monikers, but I'm trying to get at something here. By demonizing liberalism tout court, Deneen isn't just criticizing individualism, he ends up running roughshod over liberalism's legacy of securing the dignity and agency and protection of individuals. Liberation, interestingly, almost always has a negative connotation for Deneen. Wringing his hands about all the ways liberalism liberates individuals from the givenness of their condition, Deneen fails to honor the ways that liberalism secured a freedom from the tyranny of nature, what our friend Nicholas Wolterstorff called freedom by mastery. So before you start harumphing about resisting the givenness of nature because you read a Rod Dreher blog post about gender reassignment, consider all the ways that penicillin and refrigeration and mass agriculture have liberated billions from the givenness of hunger and disease. By castigating liberation as always and only transgressive and reality-denying, that is, by making liberation always Promethean, Deneen misses the Galilean legacy of liberation that infused early liberalism, working out the word of the one who came to proclaim liberty to the captives, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, Jesus' first public words of his ministry. This isn't just a semantics, I don't think. It's crucial to properly diagnose our current malaise. So let me suggest a distinction that I think is both conceptual and I think works historically. Historically, I am not a historian nor a political scientist, so that's my hedge. But historically, I would like to suggest that there is a distinction between something like early modern liberalism as vision and experiment, and late modern liberalism as its own worldview, or what I might call a social imaginary. Conceptually, this might map onto a distinction between what we might call liberalism as a social architecture versus late modern liberalism as its own ethos, its own mythology about autonomy. It is the latter, liberalism as ethos, that MacIntyre describes as liberal individualism. While this is without question a dominant expression of what liberalism has come to mean, I don't think liberalism per se is synonymous with liberal individualism. So, in fact, one could be very critical of the inadequacies and distortions of liberal individualism and not necessarily critical of liberalism per se. Indeed, one might be critical of liberal individualism for the sake of liberalism as social architecture. In that case, the repair of our corroding social infrastructure, which makes many susceptible to the demagogic allure of a strong man who promises that he alone can fix it. Remember Infrastructure Week? This mode of repairing the institution will include challenging liberal individualism as an ethos for the sake of preserving the gifts of a liberal society or polity. Or to use Deneen's metaphor, this is to refuse the claim that the pathogen of liberal individualism is endemic to liberalism as social architecture. Now, what I hope this does then is it gives you just a new set of lenses to look back and have a different account of the history that is the genealogy of where we are. This distinction between liberalism as autonomous worldview and liberalism as social architecture now provides a framework for what I hope is a more nuanced history. The legacy of liberalism is not the de novo eruption in modernity that some suggest. We deserve a more careful, theologically inflected history of liberal democracy that unveils the unacknowledged legislation inherited from Christianity, that endures in the unique patterns of liberal polity. Here, I think we still have much to learn from British theologian Oliver O'Donovan, for example. He points out, notwithstanding the discontinuity of the West with its past in Christendom, there is a legacy still apparent in the institutions of Europe and America. Even if Christendom is not our tradition, we cannot forget that it was our great-grandfathers. It lies in a fruitful constellation of social and political ideas which came together in a decisively influential way in the 16th and 17th centuries. So even granting the far-reaching effects of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and secularization, the history and legacy of these distinctly Christian and theological sources for the political regimes of the West cannot be effaced by wishing it so. Ironically, narratives of disruption like Gregory's and Denin's mimic and unwittingly, it seems to me, accept secularist tales of enlightenment. The actual story is more complex, and we need to be attuned to the vagaries of providence in order to discern it. Oliver O'Donovan offers what is one of my favorite metaphors to guide this alternative history. He puts it this way: like the surface of a planet pocked with craters by the bombardment it receives from space, the governments of the passing age show the impact of Christ's dawning glory. And a good number of these crater marks of the gospel's impact are found in the legacy of liberal polity, what O'Donovan would call early Christian liberalism, a term that sounds like it would be a contradiction in terms for Denin. While there are key political developments in Western societies that track back to the legacy of ancient and medieval Christianity, there are distinct features of liberal societies that do not emerge until the Protestant Reformation. So I won't pretend that there's not a little Protestant Catholic polemic at stake in our debate, and I'm just trying to make explicit what I think has been sort of under the surface in conversation so far. And I have none of the inferiority complex vis-a-vis Rome. In Desire of the Nations, O'Donovan highlights characteristics of liberal society that bear the imprint of the gospel. I'm just going to give you a snippet of this here. This is a long, arduous section of Desire of the Nations. All of Desire of the Nations is arduous. But for example, liberal society is, of course, characterized by liberty. But we need to appreciate that this discovery of freedom, contrary to secularist narratives, was a gift of the church's witness. For the voice of a prophetic church in its midst, O'Donovan says, which speaks with divine authority, loosens the hold of existing authorities and evokes the prospect of liberty. So it is the gospel that unleashes freedom, the Spirit of the Lord that secures liberty. God has done something which makes it impossible for us anymore to treat the authority of human society as final and opaque. He has sent the Anointed One to rule, and wherever he has appeared, to John the Baptist by the Jordan, to the sick in Capernaum, to the crowds in Jerusalem as he entered on an ass, he has loosed the claims of the existing authority, humbling them under the control of his own law of love. Even if there are countless ways this remains unrealized in the secular. In this sense, evangelical liberty, and when O'Donovan says evangelical liberty here, what he means is this is not a finding of natural law. It is the outgrowth of the distinctness of a gospel proclamation. Evangelical liberty has proved to be the foundations of a more generalized freedom. So despite all the ways that freedom has morphed into mere autonomy in late modernity, which we would share a concern about, we shouldn't demonize freedom or liberty as such. In his later work, Ways of Judgment, O'Donovan cautions that even our off-the-rails individualism in the West bears the marks of the gospel in enduring ways. So he rightly emphasizes that the individual needs to have some transcendence with respect to society. This honoring of the individual was, in fact, one of the legacies of the gospel's impact on politics in the West. Not just an natural insight, but an evangelical impact, and one not really realized until the era of the Protestant Reformation. There's an important insight embedded here that isn't simply polemical. It's an argument made by others that the unique rigors and calling of the priesthood of all believers, of lay leadership versus clericalism, was a key factor in the emergence of constitutional democracies in early modernity. Our colleague in history, James Bratt, for example, points out the distinctly Calvinist legacy of constitutionalism in the mid-Atlantic region, a distinctly Christian backstory to the U.S. experiment. In the pluralist context of the pre-revolutionary Eastern Seaboard, where, Bratt says, any claim of religious establishment was a pipe dream, Bratt observes that what emerged was a distinctly Calvinist solution. He puts it this way: the Calvinist solution lay in its old strain of constitutionalism and due process. Presbyterians and Reformed folk love due process. A strong church order designed to contain and resolve conflict in the house of the Lord, and a civil constitution that kept order while guarding liberty in the city of man. Bratt highlights the ripple effects of John Witherspoon's Protestant vision as president of Princeton, then the College of New Jersey. Here's how Bratt puts it. Witherspoon's political Calvinism emphasized the responsibilities of public service and the centrality of law, first to legitimate the revolutionary process and then to stabilize the post-revolutionary settlement. His most distinguished student was James Madison, principal architect of the U.S. Constitution. With the separation of powers, checks and balances, disbursement of sovereignty between federal and state levels, and underlying strategy of multiplying factions and interests over a large republic, the document is a mirror of middle colony and backcountry experience. In other words, this is a vision for a liberal ordering of society that in many ways people had learned in the messiness of their Protestant congregations, that enlisted them as lay leaders and democratized responsibility as a fallout of our equality before God at the foot of the cross, coupled with a good, healthy dose of Calvinist suspicion of concentrated power and complex motives. Granted, the depth and scope of this democratization took time to be realized, still is waiting to be realized in ways that it should, especially for women and African Americans, most obviously. But even this, as Martin Luther King Jr. put it, was making good on a promissory note. This account of Protestant Christian sources of liberal society is reinforced from multiple angles. For the sake of time, I won't spend, I think John Whitty's work at Emory Law School tells this story in an interestingly and importantly different way, and Nick Wolterstorff's work on rights and justice also reinforces this alternative narrative. So the upshot is there can't be an inherent tension between Christian faith and liberal democracy, because in important ways, liberal democracy in America and elsewhere is the fruit of Christianity. If there is a tension or contrast, it might be between clerical habits of mind of neo-integralism that demonizes Protestantism per se. Unlike the narratives proffered by Gregory, Deneen, and other critics, this more complex account of the relationship between faith and democracy, Christianity and liberalism, is not one of simple antithesis or Protestant decline. We can recognize contingencies and even critique the autonomism that characterizes liberalism as ethos, but we recognize even that is only half the story. O'Donovan frames this relationship in terms of a parable. We need to recognize, he says, how modernity is the child of Christianity, and at the same time how it has left its father's house and followed the way of the prodigal. But even the prodigal remains a son. We shouldn't be bolting the door against him, but looking for ways to welcome him back. At the very least, we should see the family resemblances of a brother. Christian liberalism should extend the invitation to liberal individualism to remember what it means to be free. Indeed, in some ways, I just thought of this morning, but after a conversation last night, in some ways, I think the comprehensive critique of liberalism tout court, offered by Deneen and company, a critique of not only the autonomist ethos, but also the liberal social architecture. In some ways, this feels like an attempt to change the rules of the game just because we lost. It resents the social architecture because, quite honestly, we failed the ethos contest. We have failed to convert the social imaginary of our neighbors. We have to face that. We need to grapple with that. I'm not sure that it's entirely fair to now entirely change the game just because we lost at that game. However, we also need to recognize a flip side of this history, which emphasizes that liberalism is the polity we needed precisely because of the failures of the church, and the horrors of a pre-modern integralism that gets a bit romanticized of late. As Ephraim Radner has pointed out, there is a sense in which the emergence of liberal constitutionalism was a providential chastisement of the failures of the church to live as the alternative polis it is called to be. Christians invented the liberal state, Radner points out, and they did so out of the stones of their own ecclesiological and spiritual struggles and commitments. That is, in part, a necessary propitiatory sacrifice in the face of their own sins. That this invention has in some egregious cases proven a curse is only to say that no one can ransom his own soul. For Radner, the Western Church has gotten exactly the state that it deserves. Given the realities of fragmentation, the politics of the Christian Church's division and unity must finally include and not reject the politics of the modern and now predominantly liberal state, he argues. In fact, the Church has something to learn from the liberal state. He puts it this way: Christian ecclesiology should not fear looking at these secular civil alternatives to the Church, but also should positively learn from them as perhaps examples of things the Church has simply been unable to fulfill herself. The lesson for the Church at any rate is this: let us look at our shadow in the secular world, and as one who has forgotten her identity somehow and for some reason, gain a glimpse of our better self. The lesson, Radner suggests, that we are inclined to resist might be the one we most need to learn. So what if liberalism is actually Christianity's penance? I've sketched an alternative account of the relationship between Christianity and liberalism that refuses to demonize either liberalism or Protestantism, precisely because liberal social infrastructure, for all its failure, has nonetheless over time been a conduit for liberation and flourishing for many who bore heavy yokes in the pre-modernity that Deneen romanticizes. But if my argument so far has been a retelling of the past in order to reframe our present, let me close with an argument that stems from the future, as it were. If I'm arguing for the repair of liberalism, it's not because I think it's pure and perfect. To the contrary, those invested in the repair of liberal social infrastructure are motivated, or ought to be motivated, by a deep sense of its penultimacy. That liberalism is a mode of social organization for the meantime of our waiting. In short, the repair, renewal, and reform of liberalism is decidedly anti-utopian and needs to be nourished by an Augustinian eschatological realism. And I would say this is exactly what distinguishes what I'm calling for as a kind of investment in the structures, the infrastructure of liberalism. It's exactly what distinguishes it from progressivism. Progressivism, on this account, is a kind of naturalized, over-realized anti-eschatology with Pelagian pretensions, to put it in Augustinian terms. We can unpack that if you want. It's not good, is the shorthand. Christian liberalism is the fruit of prudence, the forging of a framework for pluralist societies in the seculum, in which we don't even trust our own best motives. I guess I should explain. So the seculum for Augustine, I'm just trying to kind of bring Augustine's City of God forward. The seculum for Augustine is an era, not a place. It's a time in which we find ourselves, roughly between the cross and kingdom come. It's a messy, complicated, contested time. So, when I say Christian liberalism is the fruit of prudence, I mean it's the forging of a framework for pluralist societies in the seculum in which we don't even trust our own best motives. What's gone wrong with liberalism in our day, one could suggest, is that it has been actually unhooked from the Calvinist virtue of self-suspicion and the chastening of an Augustinian eschatology. I really do think the part of what plagues us in our current environment is exactly the loss of the eternal, is exactly the loss of an eschatological orientation. So that now we've effectively naturalized all life. We inhabit this immanent frame, as Taylor puts it. That means that, in a way, what should be penultimate is ultimate for us, and it's exactly why we treat our political differences as heretical anathemas. And in many ways, if we could recover a proper eschatology, which requires an imagination, we would deflate our political identities and investments. This is exactly why I'm skeptical about Deneen's appeals to the local as what emerges after he lets liberalism implode. Now, listen, I love my front porch too. It's the only place my wife will let me smoke cigars. I love front porches, okay? But appeals to household economics and local markets seem to suggest that brokenness is a feature of scale and seems far too sanguine about the actors who inhabit these structures. Deneen tells us that local markets, quote, will foster relations built over time and in place, and necessarily point us beyond individual calculation. Sellers and buyers make their exchanges with an awareness of how their relationships help build a better community. Ah, yes, the economy of the Shire sounds lovely, but you'll forgive me if I have my doubts. It wasn't liberalism that taught people self-interest and introduced vice into the world. We need structures and systems that presume vice. There's nothing inherent in the local that guarantees virtue. Indeed, experience has taught us that the retreat to the local is accompanied by its own unique vices, tendencies that liberalism is designed to counter. But there's also, we could just have a conversation about the civil rights movement and what localities were doing with respect to racial rights. But there's also a hint of a kind of almost what I would call a small-scale version of over-realized eschatology at work here, trying to build a society that gets it right, whereas liberalism is the architecture for a truly secular society, now in the terms of that era in which we find ourselves. It's a society that inhabits what Augustine calls the permixtum of the seculum, the messy contestedness of the seculum, and it's a polity that expects disagreement about what it means to get it right. St. Augustine once counseled the Roman governor and general Boniface with a prescient word of eschatological advice. We ought not to want to live ahead of time with only the saints and righteous, he cautioned. It's a great line. We ought not want to live ahead of time with only the saints and the righteous. Liberalism, I suggest, is the polity for those who know how to wait. One might almost say it's the polity of an Advent people. Thanks very much.
We have time for a few questions. Go ahead and raise your hand. Please make sure they are questions, and we will start with Professor Deneen.
Yay!
I told Jamie that I would have to leave immediately after his talk. I assume because of what he would say, which I was just joking about. And so the fact that I'm here actually is...
Now you're just stating that you are leaving because
I am
of what
leaving, so I just wanted to say goodbye. No. No, thank you. I really appreciate a reader who is you know, really quite explicit about some of what are really fundamentally theological differences, which it's not a you're quite right that it's not a stated theme in some ways in the book. I didn't write it as a theologian. I'm not a theologian. I wrote it as a political theorist. The 500 years, I was thinking more people like Descartes and Francis Bacon, but we could say those are extensions of the Protestant Reformation. But I have a question, which I'm really curious to hear your response to, which is, it's interesting to me that your portrayal of I think you called it liberal polity and liberal ethos. Yeah. It's striking how much that's also an understanding embraced by so many of my conservative Catholic friends. I mean, I think people like Robbie George, my colleague Philip Munoz, all of whom argue that in exactly, I think, the same terms, that you have what we in some ways attempted to institute was a liberal polity, that would allow the flourishing of, in many ways, a non-liberal, even illiberal, to some extent, ways of life, forms of belief, and so forth. And what they have had to do and develop to quite a great extent is to explain why it is that that structure, those sets of structures intended to allow for the flourishing of sort of non-liberal forms of life, has led us now to this point where we have so much evidence of this liberal ethos. And the explanation they give, in fact, touches on something that you said, which is the kind of what's explained as what I call the kind of foreign contagion of German progressivism. So I'm just curious, from your standpoint, as perhaps more of in the theological, philosophical world as opposed to the political world, whether this is something that you've thought about. What is the? I mean, is it entirely contingent? Is it merely an accident that could have gone extraordinarily differently? Is there some external explanation? Is there some kind of internal tie? Of course, my argument tries to, or suggests that these two are linked fairly strongly.
Yes.
And I'll conclude my question by saying I learned this theory from a man who would wear an orange tie every St. Patrick's Day in my classroom. Right. So just to tell you that there is a kind of Presbyterian world that worries about not only the ethos, but its connection to the structure. So thanks very much.
No, it's a great question. Thank you very much. And thanks for a very provocative book that deserves this kind of attention and discussion. I see this as also a version of the question that you were asked over here last night about the mechanisms question, right? So it seems to me, three things would interest me. First of all, I would love to have control societies where I could see, does this spin out differently somewhere else? So that would be one. That's the quasi-social scientist in me. Secondly, I'm also not, I don't think it's problematic for me to admit that there are risks inherent in the project that are latent possibilities that could be realized and be bent in a certain sort of direction, right? So I think, and at that point then you'd frame the question, Will Caterberg was doing this a little bit yesterday, it's like, would you rather risk this possibility of deformation rather than miss the possibility of liberations that take place? And there's a cost-benefit analysis that has to happen there. My account of it is a little bit like what Kristen Johnson was saying this morning is there's a failure of those religious communities to have engaged in deep formative imagination capturing practices such that they didn't confuse the identification with the polity with their identification as ethos kind of thing, right? And I think your pushback would be to say, well, was there something in the social infrastructure that primed them to make that failure? That's where we would have to debate about. I'm just not convinced that has to necessarily be the case, and it does seem to me that a lot of those formative communities of an alternative ethos were at work, which is why the experiment worked so well for so long on borrowed capital. I think that's Yuval's argument in Fractured Republic. And then one place where you and I would really agree is I do think the sources of a consumer capitalism have a unique power to flatten, and it is the rival Catholicity of our day, and it's also global. And I think the churches, for example, and other religious communities were just utterly naive about how formative and deformative those practices were. Now, whether that's inherently bound up with liberalism as social architecture, I think there's a piece of that. I'm also not willing to just demonize capitalism. I think there's configurations of it that we're talking about here, but that would be a longer answer. That's exactly the question, though. I appreciate it. Thank you. Here comes the Wendell Berry question.
No, I was going to say thank you because I'm a front porcher, but I'm a Protestant on the front porch, so I need to find some way to.
I'm trying to make for an awkward Thanksgiving for you guys. That's kind of what I'm going.
Good. I just want to go back to your fable you opened with, and this idea of rebuilding it better, and ask a sort of Wendell Berry question, which is, can it be rebuilt better if liberalism has depleted, or this rendition of liberalism, has depleted the moral, but particularly the ecological resources, right? And this sort of, we've spent out a lot of our ecological capital. So can we build something, and this is a big part of Deneen's book that hasn't been talked about much actually these last 2 days, that there are some real ecological costs. So yeah.
No, that's a very, and you're right, that's one of the chapters that has not gotten much attention here. I haven't thought about that enough. I think it's a fair concern. Do we have the capital we need to even invest in this rebuilding project? Is it a problem of a lack of social capital in that regard, or ecological capital? Is it a failure of its distribution? Is it, you know, have we not figured out how to mine it, so to speak? That's a great question. I won't pretend to have an answer to it, though. That's great. That's your job.
The question was just asked about a repair, and I know you had mentioned earlier, repair looks like, on some level I wrote down, infusing, again, kind of this proper eschatology almost into liberalism, so that we don't get too caught up with this utopianism in this world. Is the church having the capital to do that? Does it look like the church in exile, the church persecuted, so that the church is reaffirmed again and comes to a reawakening of a proper eschatology, so that we can then inform the culture? It's part of the problem that the church right now doesn't have a proper eschatology, that we are trying to live so much into a utopia. Almost in this world, we've almost been co-opted, that we need to be chastised. Might that be what repair looks like?
I do think part of the scandal of this kind of project or argument, I try to unpack this in more detail in Awaiting the King, is in some ways now, I don't want to overstate this, but in some ways and to some degree, the renewal of the church becomes the condition of possibility, not because of renewing liberal democracy, but it would be one of the follows. In other words, if we think about, do we have the capital we need? We certainly don't have the church we need. I think as long as your church is has choirs singing "Make America Great Again," we're not that church yet, right? The eschatology is messed up. So I do think that this should be an encouragement to, and again, I don't want to instrumentalize what the church is for. The church is here to bear witness to kingdom come and to pray. But I do think that somehow we need to invite more of our neighbors to entertain an ultimacy beyond what they've settled on as ultimate. And I'm not making any predictions in that regard. All I'm saying is the more we have naturalized our political life and our political identities, the more it seems like it has contributed to actually our failure to be able to live well together in a mixed polity in the meantime. So I'm just saying the church's witness, and other religious communities witness too, by the way. There's a lot of room for collaboration for religious communities in a post-secular kind of context to think about this. I just don't want to, I mean, in a way it goes back to Patrick's concern. The functional naturalization of our churches is another symptom of the degree to which we've been deformed and assimilated to this broader culture. So somehow we have to start with a renewal of our communities themselves. I just think the eschatological imagination is underplayed in this regard. It's because we still talk about the rapture and things, which is not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about what does it mean to understand that there is a kingdom that's coming and that we don't make it arrive, something like that. Yeah, it's a big project. All it means is we're working on multiple fronts concurrently. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation. My question is, to what extent does the apocalyptic vision of Christianity conflict with liberalism's flexibility to overcome seemingly insurmountable odds at every turn?
Can you say more about what you mean by apocalyptic in that context?
Well, Christianity traditionally has said the end of the world is coming and you know not when.
Oh, okay, okay.
And liberalism contradicted that 300 or 400 years ago by saying, no, most of the people aren't doomed to starve to death. No, the end isn't coming tomorrow, and we as individuals have found a way to overcome these problems.
Yeah, so this might be one of those places where now Christians need to try to work out and make sure we're on the same page in terms of what we are envisioning as this eschatological end, right? So in the long-standing eschatological picture I have in mind, there is an apocalyptic element, which is only the Father knows the day and the hour. There's an expectation of a kingdom coming. But we also have some clues and signals about what's coming, and in the prophets and in the book of Revelation. And so that actually there's a sense of what it looks like to work faithfully in the meantime of our waiting is motivated by a sense that even our best cultural labors in a way are not going to be burned up and thrown away, that in some sense they get caught up into what's coming in that kingdom. So our friend Rich Mao has a wonderful little book on Isaiah 60, when the kings come marching in. And he loves to focus on how in Isaiah 60's vision of that coming kingdom, the ships of Tarshish sail into the kingdom, and even our cultural labor in a way gets caught. That cultural labor that is oriented to what God wants for his creation, even that work gets caught up. So there's this sense of why you could have a motivation for faithful cultural, political, public labor in the meantime of our waiting, because we don't think the end is plan C. You know, it's a renewal of the earth, not a jettisoning of it. And now but not all Christians think about the end in that way, and this is where Protestants would have to work out some of our differences in that regard. Yeah, it's a good question.
Well, with that, I think we are just about out of time. Would you join me in thanking Professor Smith?